When it appeared that P-31 might not take part in the peace celebrations in August 1919 and either be mothballed or sent for scrap, Dicky contrived for Princess Mary, daughter of George V, to tell her father that she wanted to visit a P-boat and persuaded him to come as well. It was great publicity for the young naval officer, and it saved the ship. Dicky was already showing that he was very happy to use his royal connections for the benefit of himself and the Navy. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise, and today we're doing chapter 2 of the Mountbattens. This chapter is all about their years as students, particularly right around end of high school, going into college, some finishing schools that Edwina did, a tour to Europe. We sort of skim over that. Predominantly, as with the last chapter, we do mostly talk about Dicky, but we go back and forth between Dicky and Edwina and the years that they spent right around the end of their teenage years and into their 20s. So there's a lot of ground that we cover. It's not a particularly long chapter, but it's very interesting to see what the lives of people in this class were up to. You know, again, this is World War I, so we're right in the throes of World War I. It's just very interesting to see how that world event was affecting them. Edwina wouldn't seem affected all that very much. Dicky's education obviously stopped because as somebody who was in naval training, he then needed to go serve. But he was sick quite a lot in this chapter. You know, every time I turn around, he was battling some ridiculous fever. Surprisingly, neither Dicky nor anybody else in his life that were very close to him seemed to have died from the flu. Remember, this was also the time of the Spanish influenza, and that was a true pandemic. Now, there's just the tiniest little touch of it in one segment of his life when he was working as lieutenant on a submarine. But it's surprising to me how that really didn't affect very many people in his life, at least that we're told about. Edwina, we're not even told about it at all. So it's interesting because we have these huge world events that seemingly affected so many people on a really practical level. And these two characters seem like they were almost like characters in the play of the real world. Like, in other words, they're going through all the same hard things other people did, but it almost seems like their echelon in society kept them afloat. It was like they were just actors in this thing. You know, Dicky's over there having the time of his life, you know, and Edwina, of course, is very couched in safety and security financially. I'm not saying that she was always super happy. I mean, the situation with her stepmother was very difficult. Her mother had died. Her dad was aloof. So I'm not saying that, oh, you know, because she had money, she never had any troubles. I'm just interested to see like these major events that were just eviscerating everybody else's lives almost don't even skip a beat, these two. And life seems very easy for them. But in this chapter, we also discussed the name change. Remember how confused I was in the last chapter? Look, you guys, I get a lot of comments. People are like, you don't know enough to be reading these books. You know, you never know this, you never know that. You're always having to go back and correct. Yeah, you're right. I mean, I don't. That's why I'm reading these, because I don't know some of this history. I don't know a lot about the upper classes of England. And I don't think that there's any shame in learning publicly with you what I do and don't know. One of the things I hadn't known last chapter was that Mountbatten wasn't always their name, but that they had been known as the Battenberg family. And of course, with anti-German aggression on the rise, they felt the need to change their name. That is so profoundly life-altering, I think. It would be so odd to suddenly go by a completely different last name. And maybe I live in a moment in time in which everybody's just constantly in an uproar about everything, and everything's trauma and everything's tragedy, But it does seem like it would be very, very difficult to have gone by one name your whole life, and proudly, and then suddenly you have to completely change your name and go by a different name, and you're just supposed to just keep going. I mean, that's like, you know, when people get like plastic surgery or something on their face, and there are times when people have like real identity crisis because they look in the mirror and they hadn't liked their face before, but now who they see isn't who they've always known. And it seems like it would be a similar reaction. Like, my name is changed, and when I hear my name, it's like, yes, I changed it because I wanted to. I thought it was a good idea to change it, but then it just seems like it would be very jarring every time you heard it. Anyway, we cover that, not ad nauseum, but because I hadn't known it last chapter, I learned it this chapter. Also, thank you to all of you in the comments who let me know how it was. All right, let's go ahead and get into this. It's not a super long chapter, but, we got things to discuss. All right, begins out with Dicky. Dicky had ended his Osborne career on a high note, graduating first in physics, second in engineering, and third in seamanship. In January 1915, he moved on to the Britannia Royal Naval College, more commonly known as Dartmouth, for the next stage of his naval training. He again threw himself into student life, editing a magazine with close friend Kit Bradford, beagling, running, fencing, playing cricket, rugger, tennis, fives, and squash, generally with more enthusiasm than success, and attending the Saturday night dances with wives and daughters of officers on the station. He's very busy, and that is definitely a marker of who he is. He's always getting involved in the social aspect of wherever he happens to be. Before the term was ever really used, he was a networker. It doesn't seem like he was being falsely associative with people. Like, it doesn't seem like he was pretending to be people's friends in order that he could continue to, he could use them down the road. But he does. I mean, he was a very friendly person. He was always involved, but there definitely seemed like a purpose to all of that. And I think that he's going to go on to have a lot of success, not because he was naturally very skilled. Athletically, he wasn't that skilled. We're going to talk about his education. I mean, he worked hard in his education, but he wasn't naturally brilliant. But he was very, very, very good at talking, and he was very good with people. And if you have those two skills, you can really use it to your advantage if you want to. And he certainly knew where his skill set lay and invested in that. And so socially, he was always everywhere because that's really where his natural skills led. He may not have been a natural athlete or a natural scholar, but he certainly was a natural people person. And that will cover a multitude of sins. So that's really, I think, how he's going to be climbing the ranks here. But the book goes on to say, and I don't know that I agree with this whatsoever, but the book goes on to say that here at his time at Dartmouth, there was a lot of men playing around with each other. The author believes that it's inevitable that boys going through puberty, thrown together with very few girls, should indulge in adolescent homosexual experimentations, though Dicky's reaction to his colleagues' antics to a later generation may appear priggish and naive. Well, I'm the later generation, and I don't think it's priggish or naive to be like, wait, why are we all like jumping in each other's beds? That's kind of weird. Like, I don't think the absence of women is the reason, like, everyone's just like, well, I guess I'm gay now. So I don't know if I believe in that, or even not necessarily gay, but like, I just don't think that a whole school of boys is going to suddenly be like, well, since there's no women, I guess for a time, I'm just going to dilly-dally. I don't know that I agree with that, but he certainly was horrified. And what's really interesting is he wrote his mom and told her about it. And that's another theme throughout this chapter, and possibly throughout the whole book. How much he shared with her. They were very open with each other. And I don't even know that there's that many people today who would be this open with their mother. So particularly for that time and era, it is astounding, the openness. And clearly the non-judgment he felt, that he could tell her anything, and he did. He wrote to her and said, Dr. Moon is going to have a talk with me soon. People here are becoming too swinish for words. It's awfully difficult not to get contaminated by them when you have them talking filth, or almost worse still, hinting nasty things during meals. And when we're in bed and in the gunroom, some people in the other dormitory have begun to do filthy things, I've heard. Now, we don't know what Mother thought about this statement, but the very fact that he would feel that the freedom to write and tell her about this really speaks for the level of closeness of their relationship. All right, well, he finally manages to break away from the filthy things that people are doing and saying, and he goes away on holiday, and he spends it with his brother George. Now, you'll recall that George was a lieutenant on the HMS New Zealand, and surprisingly, Dicky's allowed to tag along, just go hang out on the ship, which, what a world where you can just go hang out with your brother for a while. Nobody seems to have cared that he's just hanging out on the ship, but there he is with his brother steaming off Heligoland, and the ship was guarding the edge of a large minefield and covering some 2,000 sea miles. Dicky wrote in his diary, "I'm having the time of my life." George had been given a portable projector for 35mm films, and he would borrow films from a local cinema and show them to the ship's company. This really kindled a passion for films for Dicky, and he enjoyed that passion for the rest of his life. Now, for the first of many times, Dicky is sick. Dicky had been in isolation hospital with German measles for most of May. Then in July, he was ill again. The thing is, he was often prone to injury, not necessarily sickness, although he seems like he's taken down by every fever that runs through the place. But he was often in the hospital because he was very daring. He didn't necessarily have athletic skill, but he certainly had courage, and he would always be trying things, but he would also be injuring himself consistently. In February 1916, he sprained an ankle in a tobogganing accident, and he broke his leg, and that required him to sit his final exams in the hospital. He was unbelievably bored, so he decided that what he would do, he would put in an advertisement into the Times to see if he could get some interesting correspondence going. He wrote, "A young naval officer injured and in hospital desires correspondence." So you can imagine, young naval officer doesn't have any problem getting some correspondence. And he wrote to his mother, "On Saturday I got 100 letters and today I got 75 letters with the possible prospect of more to come. They vary from a society girl in Curzon Street and a merry widow in Stanhope Gardens to a typist in Whitechapel and a chauffeur who looks after a Ford car." In the end, he had over 200 women vying for his affections, and he ended up having to place another ad in the newspaper saying, "Sorry, I can't answer all these letters individually, so thank you, but I got to put a stop to this." Well, eventually he left Dartmouth in April 1916 for his first posting in July of that same year, and he was the junior midshipman to Admiral Beatty's flagship HMS Lion, employed as a general dog's body to the captain John Chatfield. He said, "My action station is on the Forge Bridge, which I believe is about the best station going. Only one suffers rather from the blast of one's own guns," he wrote excitedly to his mother. And the whole description is just so breathless. I mean, you can still hear sort of the untarnished enthusiasm of youth. Here he is, an experience in his voice, and hope and expectation and all that he writes. And there's just there's no edge of bitterness or disappointment yet. He's still so excited to be there. And, who's to say how he felt by the end of it? Perhaps we'll eventually find out. But at this point, he wrote, "I am awfully pleased to be up there, as one can see something of what's going on. My chief job is tending voice pipes, and that's where the admiral and his staff are, as a rule. At sea, I'm in the White Watch, and I watch at the 4 guns by night with 2 other fellas. At day, I keep submarine watch. I've been having a ripping time." It's all a game, It's all fun now. And it usually is for most soldiers. At the beginning, you've had all this training, you finally get to go. It's a joy. You're with your brothers in arms. There's this huge camaraderie. You've trained for this. You're excited for this. It's all been leading up to this, and it's a game at first. It's a huge, gigantic, lovely, wonderful game. But it doesn't always stay that way once you actually meet the enemy. The sub-lieutenant in charge of the gunroom was a bully and took every opportunity to curb the natural exuberance of the young midshipman. But Dicky thrived on the discipline and hard work and on the demands of war. In August, Lion escaped a mine and a torpedo attack in the North Sea defending Sunderland from a German bombardment. Dicky was thrilled. He had achieved his ambition and had been bloodied in war. We're going to take a break from Dicky and let's move on to see what old Edwina's up to. Now, in order to divide and rule, Molly, the evil stepmother, had decided to send Mary to boarding school. For whatever reason, she didn't send Edwina off, probably because Edwina was not a problem child. I mean, she was very disciplined and orderly. The way Edwina dealt with difficult circumstances in her life was to try to wrangle control where she could, and that meant being a very organized and meticulous individual. Well, a person like that is very easy to parent, but a person like that often doesn't get much attention because the parents leave that child to sort of just figure it out on their own. Meanwhile, Molly was like, "Mary, boarding school." So Mary's gone. It's also a lot easier to reign and rule in your household if you don't have the messiness of these 2 sisters coming together and sort of relationship undermining your authority. So she divides them. And Edwina continued her lonely childhood at Broadlands, her main enjoyment baiting her stepmother. A favorite ploy was to write in French or German, languages that Molly could not speak. Most of the day was spent in lessons with her governess, Miss Atwood, but there was time to ride and hunt with the Hursley hounds, and she read voraciously. A Study in Scarlet and Dombey and Son became particular favorites. It was then her short-sightedness was discovered, and she was prescribed spectacles, but discarded them whenever she could. This, of course, led to lifelong headaches. From an early age, Edwina was organized and tidy. She cataloged all the books in the schoolroom. She kept her diary scrupulously, even down to when anybody came to visit, she would write when they came, when they left. It was all in an effort to maintain what small control she could have. Evidence of that came in the summer of 1916 when she learned that she too was going away to school. The excuse was that she was felt to have too few companions. You gotta have some friends. You gotta be socialized. But the thing is that she noted in her diary it was clear that the reason was that Madre wanted to get rid of me and Miss A, the pig. I'm sure she had plenty of companions. But Madre probably was just like, oh, this is really annoying having to be a mother. Let's just send her to boarding school too. In September 1916, age 14, she joined Mary at the Links in Eastbourne, which was run by Miss Jane Potts, a former governess to Queen Victoria's granddaughter, Princess Alice, and known to the girls as Potty. How unfortunate for Miss Jane. Edwina quickly shone, coming top in French and German, excelling in music, drawing, and English literature, and playing in the cricket and tennis teams. Now with schoolgirl companions, her strong competitive streak came out, but she champed at the petty rules and restrictions. She was used to being a free spirit, and found the routine and discipline at school life irksome. Yeah, that would be difficult. To have gone from having a governess and pretty much free run of the place, suddenly now have all these silly rules, things like, on Sunday you can come and get one piece of candy from the headmistress or whatever the dumb rule is. All right, well, after she got done with Potty at the Links, it was time to move on. In the autumn of 1918, she followed several of her friends to Aldhouse, a mixture of finishing school and domestic science training college on the Suffolk coast at Aldburg. Its aim over the year's course was to teach 20 girls at a time how to run a household. The training ranged from cleaning, cooking, dressmaking, and doing their own laundry to comportment, etiquette, ordering stores, and paying wages. I find it really interesting that a girl of her economic standing would take a course like this. Not the bit about etiquette, comportment, ordering stores, and paying wages, because all of that surely would come in exceedingly helpful and useful. It's very practical advice for somebody first dating who would have staff. She would need to know how to run the show. So I think that's amazing. But I'm intrigued by the fact that she would also have learned the intricacies of cleaning, cooking, dressmaking, and doing her own laundry. I think those are marvelously practical skills for the rest of us. I wonder how they thought that she was ever going to use those skills, and it seems to me that they might have used her time more wisely. I don't think that Edwina, the richest woman in the world, will eventually be her title, would need to know how to make a dress, but I suppose it's something to do. As always, Edwina flourished, and she was one of the 2 students to represent the school at a domestic science display in London in July 1919. It should have been invaluable training, but from the day she left, Edwina never again picked up a broom or a kitchen utensil. Now free from the constraints of formal education, her adventurous nature determined that she would see the world. Well, did anyone think she was going to go home and start scrubbing the kitchen floor and cutting out dresses? I mean, should anybody be surprised that she didn't pick up a kitchen utensil? Look, I think a training this practical is fantastic. And I think that it would be incredible if everybody had that opportunity. I just am surprised that it seems so impractical for somebody who is never going to do any of those things. All right, well, done with Edwina, back to Dicky. What's he doing? Dicky's discovered he's a writer. Naval policy was not to let 2 brothers serve together. So when George joined Lion in February 1917, Dicky was transferred to Queen Elizabeth. Again, he threw himself into the ship's activities, never one to be left out in the cold, and this time appearing as a flower girl and in the chorus in 3 Peeps, a musical muddle in 3 acts, and editing a quarterly magazine, Chronicles of Queen Elizabeth. It had a print run of 1,100 copies. Dicky had written short stories at school. One was about a midshipman called Richard Norman and a new type of motor-propelled destroyer called the Okapi, which can act as a submarine. And with time on his hands under the nom de plume N.O., he had been invited to write another for the naval magazine, Sea Pie. Soapy, The Tale of a Dog, was the story that he wrote. About a cocker spaniel on board a battleship, and was based on his own experience with a spaniel called Bubbles. I'd be interested to see how he wrote that story. It could have been entirely entertaining, or it could have been exceedingly dull. That is a story that could have really gone either way. We'll never know. Now, both Dicky and George were stationed right outside Edinburgh on their respective ships, George on the HMS Lion and Dicky on the Queen Elizabeth. And both brothers saw quite a bit of each other. In 1916, George had married the exotic and vivacious Nada de Torby, who was a daughter of the Grand Duke Michael of Russia. She was also the great-granddaughter of Alexander Pushkin. And Dicky often went to their home on the Firth of Forth, riding there on his Douglas motorbike. So they were together a lot, which then raises the question of comparison. Them being so close, not necessarily in age, but in occupation, it did lead people to compare them quite a bit. And George was regarded as the more brilliant of the two brothers. The second Master Osborne thought him the cleverest, though the laziest cadet he'd ever known. But George was known to be mechanically minded, reputedly, age 5, putting a family clock back together after dismantling it. By the age of 10, he had his own workshop. And by 15, he was designing and constructing working models of steam engines. He was really known as a real tinkerer, inventor. You sort of get the idea of Wallace and Gromit and all this. He was constantly inventing gadgets to make life more comfortable, including an early form of air conditioning, which worked by having a thermometer with electric contacts that switched on a fan if the cabin was too hot and a radiator if too cold. He produced hot and running water in his cabin using small electric lathe motors to pump the water and created a device controlled by an alarm clock to produce an early morning cup of tea. Very interesting. Shortly after leaving Dartmouth, George had ridden in the procession for George V's 1911 Durbar in Delhi, before specializing as a gunnery officer and taking part in the naval actions at Heligoland, Dogger Bank, and Jutland. His younger brother revered him and vowed that if he could not compete on the same intellectual level, he would achieve success by hard work. Now, by contrast to George, Dicky, according to his first biographer, was found to be rather young for his age. Babyish. Full of enthusiasm, was ready to try anything, but not very good at games. And the other thing that was really off-putting about him was the fact that his youthfulness showed itself in lightning changes of mood, and this made some of those who served with him at that time question his stability of temperament. He was definitely always really gung-ho and willing, but this emotional immaturity, probably the after effects of having spoiled his whole life, really made it difficult sometimes for those around him. Okay, now comes the discussion of the name change. Remember, they're going to have to change their name. We brought up sort of obliquely in the last chapter, and now we're going to address it head on. The brothers' nomenclature was about to change. In June 1917, King George V was persuaded to change his German name of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor and relinquish all German titles and styles on behalf of his relatives who were British subjects. Mountbatten's father, Prince Louis of Battenberg, was forced to change his name to Mountbatten. An earlier option had been Batten Hill. Really dodged a bullet with that name change. And became the Marquis of Milford Haven, with George becoming the Earl of Medina and the younger brother, Lord Louis Mountbatten. Dicky would henceforth be known by many as simply Lord Louis. You guys, can you imagine if their last name had been Batten Hill? Why would you go with Batten Hill when you could, Berg meaning mountain, why would we go with hill when we could go with the more majestic? Good call there. Mountbatten's not bad. In November, Dicky signed up for the steam submarine K6 for the first 2 fortnight stints as part of a scheme to broaden a midshipman's training and help them to choose their specialization. And the war room, he wrote to his mother, was a grand and sumptuous compartment, in the center of which you can really stand up without bumping your head. It looks for all the world like a tuppenny tube, except that in the place of umpteen advertisements, they are bedecked with gaily colored pictures of semi-nude females out of La Vie. I continue to be astounded at what he writes to his mother. I don't really know that many guys who are 19 years old writing to their mom about all the nude pictures that are hanging up around wherever it is that he happens to be. An interesting closeness there. I'm not saying that it's inappropriate by any means, don't hear me say that. I'm startled at the closeness between he and his mother. After his second fortnight in January, he was able to tell his mother, "I have spent the happiest months I've ever spent in the service, 6 years this May, in this ship, and I am more sorry than words could ever say that my time in her is up." Of course, he'd met a girl during this time, so that might have been the reason he was having such a great time. He told his mother that he'd made the acquaintance of a very nice girl who went to one of the gun room dances in Edinburgh, where I met her, and her name is Hilda Blackburn. She's the daughter of Lady Constance Blackburn. Well, but he's always meeting somebody. Always. There's always a new girl that day. Dicky had a flavor of the week every week, and it was always somebody different. But he loved women. That's clear. Now, one thing he did find, though, while he was working on this submarine was that he really liked this kind of work. So when he wasn't being distracted by Hilda, he realized that the submarine service was what he wanted to do, and it soon became his career. Its attractions including better pay, longer periods of leave, and more rapid promotion, though the new Marquess of Milford Haven counseled her son to keep his options open for the moment. Whether through his father's contacts or as part of a scheme for naval officers is not clear. Dicky achieved his ambition to visit the Western Front, though of the 10 days he spent in France in July of 1918, because of a high fever, only 2 were actually spent with the front lines. Always sick, this Dicky. But how many times are we going to have to speculate, was it because of who he knew, or was it because of his skills, or what was it that ends up leading him to success? I don't know. But in this case, this was a very exciting time for him because for the first time he had some real authority. In the autumn, he left the Queen Elizabeth to broaden his experience, joining P-31, an escort and anti-submarine vessel, on the Dover patrol. Now a sub-lieutenant, he was the second in command of 50 officers and men with a particular responsibility for organization, paying the sailors and acting, in effect, as the ship's doctor during the flu epidemic, which claimed the lives of a quarter of the crew. That's unbelievable, because these men would have been young and good health, fit, and that a quarter of those 50 soldiers died from the flu. I mean, how did people not think that that was the end of the world? You've got a pandemic and a world war going on at the same time. Anyway, he was the one in charge. Surprisingly, he wasn't taken down with it. And then for several weeks early in 1919, he was the acting captain. It was his first real position of authority, and he relished it. When it appeared that P-31 might not take part in the peace celebrations in August 1919 and either be mothballed or sent for scrap, Dicky contrived for Princess Mary, daughter of George V, to tell her father that she wanted to visit a P-boat and persuaded him to come as well. It was great publicity for the young naval officer, and it saved the ship. Dicky was already showing that he was very happy to use his royal connections for the benefit of himself and the Navy. Yes. Well, I mean, this is a mark of his life, this continual use of the connections he has. But then at the same time, if you had the connections, why not use them? If you had come to really love this ship of yours and you thought it was going to be mothballed or sent for scrap, why wouldn't you try to do something to save the ship that had meant so much to you? So I don't look down on him for using his connections. There certainly wasn't anything wrong with him doing that in this case. There may come more times when we raise an eyebrow to his continual manipulation of his connections, but then at the same time, what's the difference? All right, now, as I said before, the women. It's always the women with this one. The names of various women now began to appear in his letters, but his first love remained the Navy, summed up by this dirty soliloquy. He wrote, "Peggy was my only joy. Poppy's now without alloy. Margery still gets a turn. Phyllis letters I can burn. Of all the P's there isn't one. Can beat my best love 31. Okay, well, new plans for Dicky, right? It's off with the old, in with the new. In the autumn, P-31 was called to help with the intervention in Russia, but the Navy had other plans for Dicky. They were sending him to Cambridge. Dicky's education had been interrupted because of the war, so they're going to go and try to sort that out. But we're going to take a break from him. Let's talk about Edwina again. That same month that Dicky started at Cambridge, Edwina and her cousin Marjorie, accompanied by Sir Ernest and Marjorie's father, set out for their cultural tour of Europe. Castle, remember that's her grandfather, was anxious that his elder granddaughter should be prepared for her coming out. In Paris, where the party started, at the Ritz, he bought her a fur coat, mole, with very smart lining, gloves, new jewels, and hats. After a week, he had to leave and was replaced by Miss Cranston, secretary to their family friend, Lady Zia Wernher. From Paris, they went on to Rome. Ostensibly, during their sojourn, the girls were taking piano and Italian lessons, visiting historic sites, art galleries, museums, the sort of educational things they should have been doing. And they were supposed to be taking tea with that formidable Mrs. Strong at the British School in Rome, but there were other distractions. Apparently, the menfolk were swarming, and Edwina didn't mind. Now, according to Edwina's biography, there was a Captain Mott with his cleft chin and neat mustache, There was Mr. Scott, so sleek with his hair looking like boot polish thinly applied to his perfectly shaped head. And still more attractive were the Italians. There was one olive-skinned gentleman with brooding dark eyes, another with his uniform of high button jacket, well-cut breeches, tight high boots, and Riccardo, a magnificent duke, by whom Edwina was utterly dazzled. So she had her eyes out for the menfolk, but you know what? They had their eyes out for her too, because the trip was all kinds of education for Edwina, who realized that she had some power over the men. They liked her. They liked her ability to keep up her end of the conversation, her wittyisms, her banter. And she realized that she had a skill set when it came to maintaining and keeping their attention. The trip had been more educative than Sir Ernest would have realized. Edwina, by nature high-spirited and strong-minded, had blossomed in this new environment where she could reinvent herself. Her adolescent pudginess had disappeared, and she had turned into a confident, beautiful young woman who knew how to flirt, dissemble, and that she was highly attractive to men. It was knowledge she never lost. Oh, she's going to go on to use that. All right, let's get back to Dicky. What's he doing at Cambridge? This whole situation at Cambridge, like I said, was part of a scheme for the naval high-flying junior officers whose education had been curtailed by the First World War. He was one of 400 officers sent to Cambridge, though one of 5 sent to Christ's College for 2 terms on a special course covering mathematics, physics, engineering, navigation, naval history, literature, languages, and ethnology. It's quite a workload for 2 terms. This post-war class differed from previous generations, as many were war veterans. Used to being in command and considerably older than the usual undergraduate, the experience was to be a formative one for the young naval officer, widening his view of the world and training him to think for himself. He, of course, quickly threw himself into the college life aspect of the experience, and he was elected to the university's sports club, the Hawks, and its most socially fashionable club, the Pit, which, as he told his father, quote, consists of all the snobs and little Eton boys, but my word, is it comfortable and the food's not bad. Also, one does meet a lot of really nice fellows, and they're of one's own class, besides the dreadful snobs. One of these nice fellas that he met was a man named Peter Murphy, who was to become not only a lifelong friend, but a crucial confidant and influence. Now, what of this Peter Murphy? Who was he? What rock did he crawl out from under? This guy's name was James Jeremiah Victor Fitzwilliam Peter Murphy. And the details about his life are rather hazy. 3 years older than Dicky and a talented linguist, he had been a scholar at Harrow, leaving shortly before his 16th birthday to spend a year at Frankfurt University. At the outbreak of the First World War, he had joined the Territorial Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment before being commissioned as a second lieutenant on the Special Reserve in March 1915, serving later with the Irish Guards. He had been injured while serving during World War I at the end of 1916 with shell shock and ICT, that's inflamed connective tissue, after losing his boots in the mud. After a period of recuperation in London, he was given, quote, temporary employment in the Foreign Office because he was believed to possess capabilities which suit him for the work of a confidential character, whatever that means. I guess they thought that he might be of some use to them in sort of espionage, maybe? I don't know. He had arrived at a neighboring college to read economics that term, and Dicky had met him in the rooms of Christopher Tennant, later the second Baron Glenconner. Murphy subsequently remembered Dicky thus. He said, I immediately felt he was different, not only from the other young naval officers, but from the other undergraduates at Cambridge. Physically, he was strikingly good-looking, with knockdown charm, second only to the popular idol, the Prince of Wales himself. I was really astonished to find a member of the royal family so free of prejudice and reaction, with such a genuinely receptive, progressive outlook. I helped him to start reading intelligent books and papers. I tried to get him to take an interest in music, which he enjoyed, though his tastes were simple. In art, his outlook was hopeless, conventional, but in politics, he was certainly no reactionary. Now look, this Peter Murphy is far left-wing, and so I'm sure a lot of his ideas were surprising to Dicky and unconventional to Dicky's way of thinking, but under Murphy's influence, he started to sort of curtail some of Dicky's middle-of-the-road ways, I guess. The author writes that Dicky, increasingly under the influence of left-wing Murphy, began to question his worldview, not least the flaws in capitalism. By nature undogmatic and pragmatic, Dicky learned to challenge the values and codes of his class. One manifestation of this was a growing interest in politics and debating, joining both the College Debating Society, the Junior Acton, and the university's Union Society. And this is a very interesting situation that he gets himself into with this debating, because I really feel like this is where he cultivated his ability to talk someone into anything. And this is really going to become a skill for him later in life, as he uses his powers of speech and persuasiveness to get what he wanted out of life. And I really feel like this is where it all began to happen, and where he realized that he was really good at that. The book says that within weeks of arriving in Cambridge, he was a paper speaker at the Union. In other words, on the program, not merely contributing from the floor. An assessment of his debating noted that he was, quote, a ready wit and a genius for turning opponents' arguments. It was recorded that he was always an attractive speaker, especially in the unprepared parts of his speech. When he has nothing to say, he still says it very nicely. And it's so interesting how easily you can twist somebody's arm to your way of thinking if they just like how you said it. Well, he had learned how to do that. His greatest triumph was perhaps the intervarsity debate against Oxford in February 1920, successfully speaking with Winston Churchill, who he later claimed he'd persuaded to come to the event at all. At the end of the term, Dicky learnt to fly at an aerodrome at King's Lynn. I've looped the loop 3 times and I loved it, he wrote to his mother. He had been taken under the wing of Lady Canard and was being invited to a lot of dances. You guys, Lady Canard came up all the time in Trader King. She and the Prince of Wales were chummy, and she had some ideas in her little head that weren't great. So it's very interesting, the company he is beginning to keep. But back to Dicky. Dicky says that he had explained the reason for his success to his mother as paying attention to the older ladies. And when he paid attention to them, they rewarded him by inviting him to more and more of their society events. He said, I found that very few people seem to take the trouble to dance or even talk with any of the older people. Most extraordinary. They're usually far more interesting than all, except a few of the young girls. Not only is it polite to do so, but it pays. Because I danced with Lady Ribbonsdale, the first night I was asked again. See, so here's the thing. I think he does have a genuine interest in people, but I think he also realizes that there's something in it for him. I mean, he literally said, it's the polite thing to do. They're also really interesting, but also, quote, it pays. So he's not like falling ass backwards into all these good times. He's planning and making decisions so that he can get what he wants out of these relationships. Dicky, always attractive to women and always besotted with someone, had now fallen seriously in love, and the subject of his affections was Audrey James. I don't even know how in the world he keeps track of all these girls. He wrote that she was the most beautiful girl of the season. This everyone admits, but I think she's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. She's nearly 18, I think. The trouble, or perhaps the safeness of it all, is that I am number 9 of her young men, though being the latest, at present apparently the most favored. It's interesting how he came to meet Audrey James, because she was the illegitimate granddaughter of Edward VII and the illegitimate daughter of Sir Edward Grey. Dicky had first seen her in an October edition of Tatler, and through Peter Murphy, invited himself to escort Audrey to a dance. The next day, he had, quote, got off with her at tea with Peter Murphy. He had then been invited with her to an opera ball at Covent Garden. And the romance continued. I'm surprised, and maybe this goes to show my ignorance as so many things do, but that Audrey James, who was the illegitimate granddaughter of Sir Edward VII and the illegitimate daughter of Sir Edward Grey, was sort of allowed to mix with this company. I don't know why I always imagined that illegitimate children were sort of squirreled away and pretended not to exist. Clearly not the case in this situation, and that Dicky Mountbatten would be considering her as really a person to pursue is surprising. I think it's surprising. Is there something that I'm missing? Do I have like a sort of Hollywood idea of the way illegitimate children were treated? Or was it typical that the illegitimate children were also sort of in the clan and were allowed to mix and mingle with their, seeming betters? I certainly don't feel like they should be ostracized. I'm not saying they should be. I just sort of thought that they were. Interesting. Okay. In December, he saw Audrey again at a dinner party given by Peter Murphy and Christopher Tennant, and he wrote enthusiastically to his mother, "How any girl can be so pretty and alive at the same time beats me. Mama, you simply couldn't conceive how lovely she is. Beats everything I've ever seen to a frazzle. Keeps 2 houses, a maid, a footman, etc. of her own, and yet she is unspoilt. Deceitful, yes, but not spoilt. She's got the weest and most perfect eyebrows under marvelous gray eyes and the most kissable mouth that God ever made." I was always told guys never pay attention to your eyebrows. Well, this guy does. But his friends were warning him about her and the fact that she couldn't commit to any of her numerous admirers. George V's sons, Bertie, the future King George VI, and Henry, the future Duke of Gloucester, were also at Cambridge as part of their education, but living outside the city and being taught by tutors. Bertie and Harry are very nice and ask me to come to their house whenever I like, as they know nobody and they feel lonely, wrote Dicky to his mother. I'm getting up a dinner party for them here. The three young royals became friendly, seeing each other in Cambridge, but also at country house weekends, such as Philip Sassoon's home, Trent Park, north of London. Now look, y'all, this guy is never one to miss an opportunity where he might really hobnob with the big names. So, hearing that the Prince of Wales was due to go on a world tour the following year, Dicky had asked Bertie to request his brother if Dicky could join him. At a dance at Lady Ribbonsdale's in December, to which Mountbatten had engineered an invitation, the Prince of Wales approached him, asking if he would accompany him. In March, Dicky was about to set out on a new adventure in his life. That is the end of that. Well, young Dicky is getting around, and he is scaling the echelons of society. Now, granted, these people are his relatives, so I guess it's not like that wild that he managed to, find his way in their inner circle, but still, he's using his time wisely. So while he might not have been thought of as smart as his brother or as physically capable as some of his other classmates, he is making up for lost time, you guys. Now, we still don't know much about Edwina. That chapter was skimpy on the details about Edwina, but I'm looking forward to getting to know more about her as we go along. I'm fascinated by what she is becoming. So I look forward to that. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I'll see you guys soon, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. Bye.